The dessert boxes hit the cobblestones with a sound that made Skyler's heart stop. She didn't have the luxury to pause and mourn the ruined lemon tarts, though. Marcus' voice, sharp and demanding, sliced through the humid air, sending a jolt of panic through her chest. She had taken this delivery order for one reason, because it was on the opposite side of town from her apartment, far from anywhere he might think to look. But somehow, despite her best efforts, he'd found her. Skyler's sneakers slipped on the uneven stones of the historic district, and she gripped the last remaining box of desserts to her chest, the wedding cake topper inside, more precious than all the other treats combined. She cursed under her breath, eyes darting around as she tried to find refuge. The Spanish moss hanging from the old oaks above offered the perfect cover, but there was no escape from Marcus. His footsteps echoed in the distance, growing closer with every second, the unmistakable sound of someone who knew exactly where to find her. She'd been running from him for 6 months now, ever since she'd left him behind without a word. A simple note on the kitchen counter had been her goodbye. The restraining order had meant nothing. Marcus always found a way to sidestep the law. The bakery where she worked had been her only sanctuary, her only safe place. But it was clear now that her world was too small, and her ex-fiancé's reach was too long. Her breath came in shallow gasps as the sound of his voice calling her name made her stomach tighten. Skyler's hands shook, a primal fear gripping her as memories of their 2 years together flooded back. He had been attentive at first, too attentive. She had mistaken it for love, but over time, his concern had twisted into control. And now he was here, chasing her down the cobblestone streets of Savannah, a city she'd once considered her sanctuary. She rounded a corner, her foot catching on the edge of a decorative runner laid across the aisle of a wedding ceremony in progress. The guests' heads turned as she stumbled forward, and for a brief moment, everything seemed to happen in slow motion. The box she clutched in her arms flew from her hands, the wedding cake topper soaring through the air in a perfect arc. Skyler landed hard on her knees, breathless, disoriented, and entirely aware of the eyes of every guest watching her. The silence that followed her crash was absolute. It was broken only by the faint sound of Marcus shouting her name, his voice growing louder as he closed in. The groom, his back to her, turned at the sound of her interruption. His eyes locked onto hers, sharp and calculating, yet something else flickered in his gaze, something intense, almost familiar. The wedding party was in chaos. The bride, her face a mask of indignation, demanded to know what was going on, her voice rising above the whispers. Phones were already out, the scene unfolding for social media to digest, but the groom's reaction was what made Skyler freeze. He raised a single hand, stilling the approaching security with a movement that was both effortless and commanding. Skyler could hardly breathe as the man, tall, dressed in a custom tuxedo that probably cost more than her rent, looked her over, assessing the situation with a level of detachment that felt almost too familiar. His gaze flicked from her to the entrance of the garden, where Marcus' voice grew louder still, and then back to her, as if weighing the situation in a split second. It felt like the world paused in that instant. "Who the hell are you?" the bride demanded, her voice cutting through the tension. Before Skyler could formulate an answer, the groom spoke, his deep voice carrying across the garden. "The ceremony is over," he declared, his tone final, without room for argument. The words hung in the air, shocking everyone into silence. His statement broke the stillness like a thunderclap. The wedding was over. The future he was supposed to begin that day had been erased in an instant by the appearance of a terrified woman who had crashed his ceremony. Skyler didn't know what had just happened or how she'd ended up here. She only knew that this was not the escape she had planned. But now, as the groom walked toward her, there was no turning back. The groom's steps were measured, confident, and surprisingly calm as he approached Skyler. The guests' whispers filled the air, but they faded into a distant hum as he stopped right in front of her. Skyler, still on her knees, felt the weight of his gaze like a physical thing. His eyes weren't full of pity or disdain, just focus, like he was studying her with an intensity that made her heart race. She couldn't move. Her pulse hammered in her ears, and her mind struggled to catch up with everything that had just happened. He reached down and extended his hand to her, not an offer, but as an unspoken expectation that she would take it. The man's presence was magnetic, an undeniable aura of control that made it impossible for her to refuse. Skyler hesitated for a brief moment, her fingers trembling from the adrenaline that was still rushing through her veins. She looked at his hand, steady and unyielding, and for reasons she couldn't explain, she placed her hand in his. His grip was firm, but not too tight, just enough to pull her to her feet with an ease that surprised her. The chaos around them continued to swirl, the bride's voice rising in indignation, the sound of security staff trying to restore order, and Marcus' shouts still echoing from behind the garden walls. But in this space, with this man, everything seemed to freeze. Skyler felt the weight of his presence without him saying a word. She couldn't explain it, couldn't understand it, but in that moment, she realized she wasn't just standing with a groom who had just called off his wedding. She was standing with someone who had a power far beyond anything she had ever imagined. "Come with me," he said quietly, his voice cutting through the din around them. It wasn't a request, it was a command, soft yet undeniable, and somehow, Skyler found herself following him without question. His hand, still holding hers, guided her away from the chaos, past the curious eyes of the guests, and into the sprawling mansion at the heart of the estate. The cool air of the building hit her as they entered, and Skyler looked around, taking in the opulence that seemed to stretch endlessly before her. Marble floors, gilded mirrors, and walls adorned with paintings so exquisite, she almost felt like she was stepping into another world, a world that had no room for her. The man led her through the grand halls, past rooms filled with guests who had no idea what had just unfolded outside. Staff members in uniforms stepped aside as they passed, their gazes lowering in deference. It was like watching a king and his subject move through the space, but Skyler wasn't his subject. She was a stranger, a runaway bride crasher with nowhere to go. They stopped at a large wooden door, and he opened it without hesitation. Inside was a library, its shelves lined with books that looked as though they had been collected over decades. The scent of leather and old paper filled the air, and Skyler took a step inside, her heart still racing, her mind spinning with questions. The man closed the door behind them with a soft click, and for a moment they stood in silence. Skyler could feel the tension building between them, the electricity in the air, and she couldn't seem to find the right words. He turned to her, his eyes studying her carefully. "You're safe here," he said, his voice low and assuring, but there was something more, something unsaid in his tone that made Skyler pause. Safe? Safe from Marcus, sure. But what about from him? Skyler opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Instead, she simply nodded, unsure of what else to say. Her mind was still reeling from the events of the day, trying to piece together the whirlwind of moments that had led her here. The man walked across the room to a sideboard, his movements smooth and deliberate. He poured 2 glasses of amber liquid from a crystal decanter, and then turned back to her, offering one of the glasses without a word. Skyler took it, though she wasn't sure if it was a good idea. The liquor inside was thick and heavy, its scent rich and complex. She brought it to her lips and took a small sip. The warmth spread quickly, loosening the tightness in her chest, but it did little to ease the confusion gnawing at her. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice breaking the silence again. "Skyler," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. She felt the weight of his gaze on her as he processed the answer, his eyes never leaving her face. "Skyler?" he repeated slowly, as though testing the name on his tongue. "And who was chasing you?" The question sent a cold shiver down her spine. The memory of Marcus, his anger, his control flashed before her eyes, but she forced it back. "My ex," she said, her voice shaking despite her best efforts to stay calm. He won't leave me alone." The man studied her with a calculating gaze, his lips pressing into a thin line. "I can make him disappear from your life," he said, his words carrying a weight that Skyler wasn't sure she understood. "Not literally disappear, but make sure he understands the consequences of pursuing you." Skyler's breath caught in her throat. The man's offer, though clear, unsettled her more than it reassured her. She had no idea who this man was, this groom whose wedding she had just ruined. And yet, in some strange way, she found herself willing to listen. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Why would you do that for me?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took a slow breath, as if gathering his thoughts. When he spoke, his voice was steady, but there was something in it that made Skyler stop and listen. "Because I can," he said simply. "And because you shouldn't have to run anymore." Skyler didn't know how to respond to that. She didn't know how to respond to anything. All she knew was that her life had just been irrevocably changed. And now, standing in the middle of this stranger's mansion with her ex still hunting her down, she had no choice but to wait and see what came next. Skyler didn't know what to make of the offer. The idea that this man, this complete stranger, could make her ex disappear from her life seemed too far-fetched, too dangerous to even consider. Yet here she was, sitting in his luxurious library, feeling a sense of safety she hadn't felt in months. It didn't make sense. Nothing about this situation made sense. Dave, the groom whose wedding she had just ruined, was sitting across from her, his dark eyes unwavering, studying her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. He hadn't once asked for an explanation about the chaos she'd just caused at his wedding. He hadn't even questioned her. Instead, he had just acted, stepping in as if he was the one in control of the situation. And, strangely, Skyler wasn't sure she hated it. The silence between them was thick, filled with unspoken words, and Skyler found herself unsure of how to break it. She took another sip of the liquor he had given her, the burn soothing her nerves slightly, but not enough to quiet the storm in her mind. Finally, Dave spoke again, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "I'm not asking you to trust me, but if you want Marcus gone for good, I can make that happen. The question is, do you want it?" Quote. Skyler looked at him, her eyes searching his face for any hint of deceit, but all she found was a calm resolve. She had no idea who this man was or what he was capable of, but there was something about his presence that made her believe he wasn't bluffing. He wasn't just some rich man trying to play hero. He was someone who had power, and he was offering it to her. Marcus had never been just a boyfriend. He had been controlling, suffocating. She had tried to leave him months ago, but he always found a way back into her life, into her thoughts. His obsession with her had grown until it became something far darker, something she had no choice but to flee from. The restraining order had done nothing. Marcus still showed up at her workplace, still found ways to send flowers, still made her feel trapped, like she was never going to escape. Skyler felt her heart race as she thought of what Dave had said. He could make Marcus disappear from her life. She had no idea how, but the way he spoke, with such certainty, made her wonder if it was possible. Her mind whirled. Was this the answer she had been waiting for? Was she really willing to take this risk? She looked down at the glass in her hand, the amber liquid swirling gently as she gripped it tighter. "Why would you help me?" she finally asked, her voice quiet, but firm. "You don't even know me." Dave leaned back in his chair, studying her for a moment before he spoke. "You're right, I don't know you, but I'm not doing this out of kindness. I'm doing this because I've been where you are. I've seen people like Marcus, people who think they own others, people who cross lines and make you feel like you have no choice but to bend to their will. I don't tolerate that." Skyler's breath caught in her throat. He had been where she was? What did that mean? She wanted to ask, but the words caught in her mouth, afraid that if she spoke, she'd expose more vulnerability than she was ready to share. Dave's eyes softened slightly, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something other than authority, something almost human. "I'm not offering you a favor. I'm offering you a way out. A way to take back control of your life, Skyler. You don't deserve to live in fear, constantly looking over your shoulder, wondering when he'll show up again. You deserve peace." Her chest tightened as his words hit home. The truth was, she didn't know what peace felt like anymore. She hadn't since the moment Marcus had entered her life, and now, after months of running, of hiding, she was exhausted. She wanted to believe him, but there was still a part of her that recoiled at the idea of relying on someone like him, someone who moved in circles that Skyler didn't understand. Dave didn't wait for her to respond immediately. Instead, he stood and walked to the window, looking out at the garden where the wedding had been disrupted just hours ago. He glanced back at her over his shoulder, his voice soft but carrying weight. "I know this is a lot to process, but whatever you decide, Skyler, just know that you're not alone in this anymore. I can't promise you a fairy tale ending, but I can promise you that no one will hurt you again without consequences." Skyler stared at him for a long moment, the words sinking in, but still unsure if she could trust them or him. She had lived so long in fear, so long feeling like she was at the mercy of someone else. Could she really step into a world where someone else made the decisions for her? But the fear, the exhaustion, the constant weight of Marcus's presence in her life, it all suddenly felt so much heavier than the uncertainty she felt in front of Dave. The only thing she knew for sure was that if she didn't do something, if she didn't take a step forward, she would spend the rest of her life running. Skyler set the glass down on the side table, her fingers trembling slightly, and met Dave's gaze. "What do you need from me?" Dave's eyes darkened with something that might have been approval, or maybe something else. "I need you to trust me. Trust that this is the only way to get Marcus out of your life for good. And once that's done, we can figure out the rest." Skyler took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his words. She didn't know if this was the right choice, but it was the only choice that felt real. She wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in months, she felt like she had a chance to take back control of her life. "I'm in," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her. "Do what you have to do." Dave nodded, and in that moment, Skyler felt like she had crossed the line. There was no going back now. Whatever came next, she was no longer running. She was standing, facing the chaos head on, ready to take whatever steps necessary to reclaim her life. And as she looked at Dave, standing across the room, the man who had just destroyed his own wedding for a complete stranger, she couldn't help but wonder just how far this would all go. Skyler's decision had been made. She had agreed to trust Dave, to let him help her escape the grip Marcus had held on her for far too long. But as the evening stretched on and the reality of her choice settled in, a new wave of uncertainty washed over her. She had no idea what she was stepping into. Dave Moretti was not a man who played by normal rules. He was a man who had just torn his own wedding apart for a complete stranger. What kind of world was she entering? And what would it cost her? The library door opened, and Dave returned to stand before her, his expression serious, but not unkind. "I'll handle Marcus," he said simply. "But in the meantime, you need to get your things in order. We're moving fast, Skyler. I'll make sure you're safe, but you have to follow through on your end too." Quote. She nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. "What exactly does that mean?" she asked, though she could already guess the answer. "It means you're not alone in this. And it means I'm going to protect you," Dave answered. His voice was firm, but it didn't hold the same coldness it had earlier. There was something else in it now, something softer, like an unspoken promise. Skyler's thoughts raced. This was the moment her life could change forever. The world she had known, her small apartment, her bakery job, the quiet safety she had carved for herself in the midst of her fears, was slipping away, and she wasn't sure if it was a relief or the beginning of something far more dangerous. She spent the next hour packing quickly, almost on autopilot. Clothes, her laptop, the recipe box her grandmother had passed down to her, everything she needed to get away. There was no time for second-guessing, no time to think through the consequences of her actions. She just needed to act. Dave's team of security guards were already waiting outside when Skyler finished gathering her things. The sense of urgency was palpable, but as she stepped into the sleek black car that was to take her to Dave's townhouse, a strange calm washed over her. The ride through the city was quick, the silence between them heavy with unsaid things. Skyler had no idea what was waiting for her on the other side of this, but she knew one thing for sure. She couldn't go back to the life she had before. When they arrived, the townhouse stood tall and imposing, a symbol of the life Dave lived. a life so different from her own that it made her feel small and out of place. But it also felt safe, and that was all she could focus on right now. Inside, the house was pristine and elegant, filled with old-world charm but modern in its furnishings. It wasn't a home that felt warm or lived in. It felt like a showpiece, a place where everything had its place. Skyler followed Dave through the grand hallway to a room that would be hers for the foreseeable future. The bed was large and inviting, the bathroom spacious, the closet filled with luxurious clothes. Everything about this space screamed wealth and status. She had barely set her things down when Dave appeared in the doorway again, a silent presence that commanded attention. He stood there for a moment, watching her with those same intense eyes that had made her feel so vulnerable before. "You're safe here," he repeated, his tone a little softer than it had been earlier. "But we both know this is just the beginning. Marcus won't stop. He'll come for you, and when he does, I'll be ready." Skyler nodded, but she couldn't help the unease that crept up her spine. She had already given up so much just by agreeing to this arrangement. Could she really keep moving forward? Could she let this stranger into her life completely, knowing what kind of power he wielded? She had no answers, only the weight of her decisions. The next few days passed in a blur. Dave's security team kept her safe, and she followed his instructions without question. She didn't know exactly what he was doing behind the scenes to deal with Marcus, but she trusted that he had a plan. And somehow, that made her feel like maybe, just maybe, she could begin to take control of her life again. But things weren't as simple as they seemed. On the third night, Skyler sat in the library again, the silence pressing in around her as she stared at the bookshelves that seemed to go on forever. She was restless, unable to sleep, despite the comfort of her new surroundings. The weight of the decision she had made, the weight of what she was asking from Dave, settled heavily on her chest. Just as she was about to stand, the door creaked open, and Dave stepped inside. His expression was unreadable, but there was a tension in his posture that suggested something had changed. "Marcus is gone," he said, his voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of something darker. "For now." Skyler froze. "What do you mean, for now?" Dave's gaze flickered briefly to the floor before meeting her eyes again. "I've made sure he understands that pursuing you further is a bad idea. But we both know that won't stop him. Not forever. He'll find a way back. It's only a matter of time." Skyler's stomach twisted, her mind racing. She had hoped, foolishly perhaps, that once Marcus was out of her life, everything would go back to normal. But the reality was far more complicated. And as much as Dave was offering her protection, the situation was far from over. "We'll figure this out," Dave added, his tone softer now. "You don't have to go through this alone." Skyler looked at him, seeing the man who had stepped in to help her, who had turned his life upside down to ensure her safety. There was something undeniable in his eyes, a raw sincerity that made her believe in him, even if she wasn't entirely sure how this all worked. "Thank you," she whispered, the words feeling too small for what he had done for her, but they were all she had. He nodded, his expression softening just slightly. "You're welcome. But remember, Skyler, this is only the beginning. We're in this together now." In that moment, as the weight of everything that had happened and everything that was still to come settled over her, Skyler realized just how much her life had changed in the past few days. She wasn't sure what the future held, but she knew one thing: she wasn't running anymore.